Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Sarah Ann Minkin, Director of Programs and Partnerships at FMEP, and I am delighted to be here today with extraordinary colleagues, Natasha Roth-Rowland, Orly Noy, and Peter Beinart, to discuss the concept of Jewish supremacy. We're recording on October 20th, 2022. Before we dive in, a few words on why we're having this discussion now. For the last few years, I've observed that people with Zionist backgrounds and affinity with Israel, some of the people I'm in conversation with, have seemed more open to listening and engaging in conversation around the ways in which Israel is a Jewish supremacist state, more open talking about Jewish supremacy than talking about apartheid. I think that somehow the concept of Jewish supremacy perhaps either resonates or makes them curious. And I've been curious about this difference, about what Jewish supremacy, the concept, might be capturing and communicating in ways that particular audiences may be able to engage. So I wanted to dig into what critics of Israel and supporters of Palestinian liberation mean when they use the term Jewish supremacy to describe the political and social structures between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. To be clear, Palestinians have long described the regime of oppression and dispossession under which they live as supremacist and also as settler colonialist and also as apartheid. In recent years, Palestinians have talked about Jewish supremacy in Israel-Palestine with particular emphasis on the ways that the nation-state law made Jewish supremacy explicit and cemented it inside of 1948 Israel in particular. The nation-state law, which was passed by the Israeli Knesset in 2018, says that the state of Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people, and that the right to self-determination there is exclusive to the Jewish people alone. The Palestinian human rights organization Adalah says that the nation-state law, and I'm quoting, quote, enshrines Jewish supremacy over Palestinian citizens and guarantees the ethnic religious character of Israel as exclusively Jewish, and entrenches the privileges enjoyed by Jewish citizens. Today's conversation is one of many that FMEP has hosted and will continue to host on the structure and nature of the Israeli regime. FMEP is not a Jewish or a Palestinian organization. We try to specifically platform Palestinian voices in our programs because it is so important and so endlessly valuable to listen to and engage with Palestinians on the issues we cover, and because Palestinians are usually excluded and marginalized in public discourse. But today we are turning specifically to Jewish thinkers to talk about how and why using the concept of Jewish supremacy is valuable. I'm not asking today's guests to speak for Palestinians. I'm asking them to speak from their expertise and their experience, and to speak about the audiences with which they interact. Having this conversation today with Jewish guests and a Jewish host is a way of using Jewish privilege to have a conversation that, were the guests and the host not Jewish, would otherwise likely be cast and dismissed as anti-Semitic. As listeners to the Occupied Thoughts podcast know well, people in the Israel right or wrong crowd use accusations of anti-Semitism to undermine, marginalize, and silence critique of Israel. Today, we're trying to hold and open more space for conversation. And I am so grateful to be joined by three brilliant thinkers and writers. So I'll introduce you to them. Natasha Roth-Rowland is an editor and writer at 972 Magazine and a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Virginia. Her research and writing focus on the Jewish far right in Israel-Palestine and the United States. Orly Noy is an editor at Local Call, the Hebrew sister site to 972 Magazine. She's a political activist, chair of the board of B'Tselem, and active with the Balad political party. And Peter Beinart is non-resident fellow at FMEP. He's also a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, editor-at-large at Jewish Currents, and an MSNBC political commentator. Hello to you all. Thank you so much for being here today. So, Orly, I want to start with you. You have been using the term Jewish supremacy to describe Israel for several years. Can you tell us what you mean by it? And when did you start to describe Israel as a Jewish supremacist regime?
Hi, thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much for having me on this show. I think that the using of this term, Jewish supremacy, began or started with a feeling that the often used terms to describe the Israeli-Palestinian reality focused mainly on the formalistic side of that reality, but somehow missed its essence. There is an entire vocabulary that we've been using along the years to describe that reality. Words such as occupation, discrimination, damaged democracy, and lately, as you mentioned, also apartheid joined that terminology. And of course, they are all valid, but I think that they are lacking in two senses. The first sense is, as I said, they are reflecting mainly the formalistic aspects of the Israeli control over the Palestinians, mainly through legislation. And I think it's no accident that in your introduction, you mentioned the nation state law. Or they are descriptive of the different practices and implementations of those laws on the ground. Occupation is a legal term. Apartheid is a legal term. Even discrimination is a legal term. And I think that legal terms very often conceal the essence that is behind them. And I think that this essence is very accurately Jewish supremacy. The other sense in which I think that the commonly used words are lacking is that those legal descriptive terms allow Israel to excuse its way out way too easily. I mean, Israelis would say, yes, there is occupation, but it's a temporary situation because of security needs. And the fact is that we have not annexed the occupied territories in the West Bank, except for East Jerusalem. Yes, there is discrimination against Palestinian citizens, but this is only because they don't fulfill their part in the political sphere. And if they only agree to sit in the government, and by that legitimizing every massacre in Gaza, every ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, and even legitimizing their own inferior position as second-class citizens in their own country, we can deal with the question of discrimination by enlarging their budgets. But the truth is that occupation is not a temporary situation, and the discrimination against Palestinian citizens is an integral part of the Israeli regime. And the even more bitter truth is that in their core, there is an entire additional layer that is not directly connected to the formalistics, but to the mindset, to the collective ethos, to the deepest self-conceptions that allow that reality to continue. And to truly understand that reality, it needs, that layer needs to be named correctly. We should honestly admit the fact that in Israel, throughout the years, developed an unspoken race theory, according to which Jews, only because of being Jews, deserve more. Now, you can find its more vulgar appearances in the teachings of Meir Kahana and of his pupils, who might very well, very soon become one of the most powerful players in the next Israeli government. But the essence, its essence, is dictating the formal, official Israeli policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians throughout the entire land between the river and the sea. And this is a combination of, let's say, more popular racism of the more familiar kind, with an institutionalized racism that understands Jewish privileges as a moral value. That thing, that point, terms such as occupation, discrimination, and even apartheid sort of miss. And this is, at least for me, the added value of the concept of Jewish supremacy.
Thank you so much. Thanks for starting us off so thoroughly and richly. So, Peter, I want to ask you a similar question. You recently used the term Jewish supremacy in a column you published in the New York Times, and you referenced B'Tselem, the Israeli organization that Orly chairs, and their 2021 publication, which was entitled "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is Apartheid." So that was your reference. What's your intention in using the term Jewish supremacy?
I think that Jewish supremacy is valuable because it connects what's happening in Israel-Palestine to a global struggle that people in the United States and other places can recognize, which is between notions of citizenship that aspire towards the idea of equality under the law and a kind of civic notion of citizenship in which you aspire towards the idea that everyone is treated equal regardless of their race, religion, ethnicity, gender, and notions that have been rising in many different countries that essentially a nation has a kind of ethnic, religious, racial core, and that core deserves to be supreme. And should be treated as superior, and anyone else who happens to be in the country are essentially at best second-class citizens, at worst not citizens at all, and are not true members of the nation. And I think that while I think that the use of the term apartheid has been important in the sense that it has emphasized the importance of recognizing that that there is one regime between the river and the sea, and that the distinction that have been so dominant, in American discourse for a long time about kind of the occupation, whether that was ever right is certainly kind of been superseded by events. But I also think that apartheid, because the term itself is an Afrikaans term and comes out of South Africa, even though there is a broader international legal definition, does tend to focus people on the question of the similarities and differences between Israel and South Africa. And I think in some ways that has also been a little bit of a cul-de-sac that people have been brought into. And so I think that in some way, and also it's in some ways it's less relevant because apartheid South Africa no longer exists, right? Whereas I think in some ways, the more interesting and relevant conversations today are about what's happening in India with a kind of Hindu supremacism, or in Poland and Hungary with a kind of a white Christian supremacism, or in the United States with a white Judeo-Christian supremacism, right? Or even in Iran, right, with a kind of with an Islamic Persian, misogynistic supremacy, whatever, how one thinks about this. And I think that part of the reason I find it appealing is that it allows us to focus on those people who are sympathetic to those struggles against supremacy in other places, and ask them to see this as part of that global struggle. And it also allows us to say that what happens in Israel-Palestine matters beyond Israel-Palestine, that it's not only that this is crucial because Palestinians deserve equality and freedom, but that the Israel-Palestine exception also makes it much more difficult for us to engage in this struggle against other places, against supremacy in other places. If you look at the way that Modi's government in India models itself on what's happening in Israel-Palestine, or if you look at the way that the attacks on human rights organizations that are led by Israelis and its defenders then kneecap them and make it harder for them to hold other countries account, whether it's in China, where there's a kind of Han Chinese supremacy. So this is the reason that I find this a kind of fertile language.
Great, thank you so much. Both of you, both Orly and Peter, you've talked explicitly about how the term is inviting the imagination of your listener. You're inviting the listener into this conversation in specific ways that are calling upon their ability to really imagine and understand the emotional side of politics, whether this is about the moral place and the essence of a kind of racism, or about who you imagine yourself to be, Peter, as you just described, as someone who opposes supremacy in other parts of the world, and how do you see Israel-Palestine? This is so interesting, thinking about Jewish supremacy and the term as an invitation to your listeners into a particular worldview and understanding. And Natasha, I want to ask you how you understand the term Jewish supremacy, and if you'll comment on what Peter and Orly said, but also specifically to help us understand how you differentiate or don't between supremacy and nationalism.
Thanks, Sarah, and it's great to be here with all of you. I don't have too much to add, actually, to Orly and Peter's very astute insights on how they conceptualize Jewish supremacism and its applications, and what they're trying to communicate to their readers and listeners and the people they engage with by using the term. I do think that it's really important to just reiterate this point Orly made about how it captures something that I think a lot of the other words that we use to describe and label Israeli repression of Palestinians kind of miss in a way. And I think that actually brings us back to this fascinating point you made in your introduction, Sarah Ann, about how people seem more open to the terminology around Jewish supremacism than around apartheid. And, I'll admit I was a little bit taken aback when you first said that, because to me, the concept of supremacism, I think, animates people a lot more. It agitates people a lot more. I think, as we've seen in some of the blowback to usage of the term, whether that is in good faith or bad faith, it really is discomforting for people, because it reminds them of something that they don't want to be reminded of in connection to the behavior of the Jewish state. But reflecting on it while Orly and Peter were talking, I think it kind of makes sense, because Peter, you were gesturing at this a little bit, but with apartheid, there's something clear-eyed and intentional about it that I think with supremacism, it's easier, even if you think of the state as acting in a supremacist way, it's easier to think of it as some kind of aberration or something that's spiraled out of control that was never intended to be that way. Whereas when you're talking about the legal architecture of apartheid, it's much, much harder to make that argument. So I kind of understand why that might sit, the idea of Jewish supremacism might sit a little more comfortably with some people than with others. And the last thing I want to say on that point is that the other utility of thinking about supremacism is that it does cover a broad range of behaviors by a broad range of actors. You mentioned the Jewish nation-state law that was passed, I think, 4 years ago. That's an example of supremacist policymaking, supremacist lawmaking by a state. And then you have the kind of other side of it, which is the grassroots side, which I think people are more willing to name, which is, violent racist mobs attacking Palestinians in the street, chanting death to Arabs and so on. And I think it's very easy to exceptionalize the idea of supremacism and again, tie it back into that idea of aberration by pointing to those kind of grassroots behaviors and saying, okay, but this is, a specific subset of people and they don't represent the majority and they certainly don't represent the state. And actually supremacism is much more all-encompassing than that. And the way I understand it, certainly in this context, is that what you see in the street is an outgrowth of what happens in the Knesset and surrounding it. The street level activity does not drive the policy making. It's the policy making that creates a fertile atmosphere and a level of permissiveness for that behavior to take place, usually with minimal consequences for the perpetrators. As for distinguishing between nationalism and supremacism and whether they overlap and how much, I mean, you could do an entire podcast just on that. There are so many different definitions of nationalism. But just in brief, for me, nationalism, not all nationalisms are supremacist from the beginning. I think that's really important to point out. On the flip side, I think supremacism pretty much always contains a kernel of nationalism. And I would also say that the potential to deteriorate into supremacism inheres in many, many forms of nationalism. I think there's very often the raw material there, and whether or not it develops in that direction just depends on the social political environment.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you for all of that. And we'll come back a little bit to conversations around supremacy and nationalism. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation around Zionism. But before we get there, you talked about the Knesset and this relationship between the grassroots and policymakers. And I think that we actually need to talk a little bit about what's happening right now with the Jewish supremacist political agenda and specific politicians and political parties. Orly, I want to ask you if you'll please talk to us about what is the Jewish supremacist political agenda and who is representing and promoting it.
Sorry. Yeah, it's I think that it's a tricky shift, to moving from speaking about Israel as a Jewish supremacist regime to specific supremacist political agendas or political actors. It's tricky because if you accept the definition of Israel as an apartheid state, which I do, apartheid is a regime of supremacy. So, you can obviously talk about Israel in its entirety as a supremacist regime. On the other hand, I think that it's very important not to oversimplify the Israeli political reality, because you really cannot put merits in the same basket, political basket, with Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich, although they are all on the Zionist spectrum and therefore entail some of that supremacist essence. I do not accept the claim held by many in the non-Zionist left that the differences between Meretz and Ben-Gvir, for example, are merely cosmetic. I think that there is more to that. It's true that Meretz is holding representatives in all of the Zionist institutions that are executing the supremacist policies, such as the Jewish Agency, the Jewish National Fund, etc. But the democratic concept as something positive, something valuable, something to be aspired, is still at the core of the ideology of the Zionist left, which cannot be said, of course, about the Israeli right altogether, and certainly not the kahanist kind of Israeli ultra-right, where the supremacy itself is a value, a virtue. So I would define it in the following way. Both the Israeli Zionist left and right are committed to the maintaining of the absolute Jewish privileges in Israel. But while with the Zionist left, the concept of democracy as a value, dictates a political stand according to which at least the individual rights of the Palestinian citizens should be expanded to the level that, of course, they do not endanger the Jewish privileges, collective privileges, the kahanist right, and here we are talking about supremacy as a virtue, as a value, the kahanist right is seeking the exact opposite, the disqualifying of or the taking down all the democratic existing barriers in order to reduce the space of Palestinian rights to the absolute minimum, both inside Israel and in the occupied territories. And those are not semantic differences, if only because they dictate counter politics vis-a-vis those stands. I think that the kahanist right should be defeated, pure and simple. We should defeat them. It should be defeated. It's dangerous, violent political growth in the Israeli politics. But I think that with the Zionist left, we should have a serious and very difficult conversation about the inherent contradiction between the character of Israel as a Jewish state and its ability to be a democratic state. And I think that this is a decision or a conclusion that the Zionist left has been avoiding for many decades now.
Thank you so much, Orly. Thank you for giving us the big picture on the trickiness of this conversation overall, speaking about how supremacy works in politics and the specificity of comparing the Zionist left and the kahanists. Natasha, will you talk to us more about the kahanists, about who they are and how they've been mainstreamed?
Sure. I'll start with a kind of positive history, just in case that's useful for listeners. I mean, I think Meir Kahane is a pretty familiar figure, but just to recap, he was born in Brooklyn, 1930s, very active in right-wing Zionist youth groups while living in New York. Started the Jewish Defense League, emigrated to Israel in the early 1970s, founded a political party called Kach with what I consider to be an explicitly fascist manifesto. He was barred from, he was elected to the Knesset with one seat in 1984. His party was barred from running in 1988, ostensibly because of its anti-democratic and racist platform, but it was very much driven by members of other right-wing parties who feared Kach would eat away at their voter share in the upcoming elections. And then Kahane was assassinated in 1990 in New York. His party, Kach, and its sort of offshoot, Kahane Chai, which means Kahane lives, were outlawed in Israel in 1994 after Baruch Goldstein murdered 29 Palestinian worshippers in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. But a kind of relatively small official under the radar core of Kach true believers persisted throughout the decades. There weren't really Kahanist representatives commonly in the Knesset. You had Michael Ben-Ari was elected in the 2010s, although the party was not explicitly a Kahanist party in the way that we now see Otzma Yehudit, which means Jewish power. That party is very much identified with Kahanism. Its members are very much, certainly its core membership, most of whom have since been ruled out of running for the Knesset, just leaving Itamar Ben-Gvir because of their previous records of racism. They're very, very strongly identified with Kahane, with Kahanism. They consider themselves his disciples. And we now see Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the head of Otzma Yehudit, depending on whether Netanyahu wins the election in a couple of weeks' time, poised to take up a ministerial role, which would be a first. That was always Kahana's dream. And now it looks like there's a real chance that Ben-Gvir could make it a possibility. Now, in terms of parliamentary numbers, up until now, a Kahanist party has only ever independently won one seat. Otzma Yehudit was pretty much frozen out in the last few elections, but Netanyahu and other senior Likud figures made repeated overtures to Otzma Yehudit and to Itamar Ben-Gvir because they saw his party as crucial to helping another right-wing party, religious Zionism, cross the electoral threshold and then before be able to form part of a potential coalition with the Likud. So while in 2019, you saw all sorts of condemnations of this approach from Netanyahu, including from American Jewish groups, what happened in the interim is that Ben-Gvir made it into the opposition and sort of pretty much overnight became a media sensation in comparison to when Kahana got into the Knesset, when Israeli media outlets sort of had an unofficial blackout, initially, certainly at first. Ben-Gvir has just been repeatedly invited to talk to reporters of different mainstream news broadcasts, sort of night after night. There was some statistic published earlier this year showing just how many minutes of airtime he'd been given by the Israeli press. And contrary to the idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant, this has actually led to a huge surge in popularity for Ben-Gvir, to the point that now he is running again in partnership with religious Zionism, and polls are making it seem as if they will be the third biggest party when all the votes are counted. The idea that Ben-Gvir as a Kahanist is somebody to be frozen out of the political discourse, that his party should be frozen out, has completely fallen by the wayside. He has been astute in sort of softening some of his stances. He tends to speak more now in dog whistles than explicit calls for mass expulsion. He took the picture of Baruch Goldstein down from his living room wall. The picture of Kahana stays there, of course. And the condemnations that we saw from American Jewish groups a few years ago have since evaporated. And I'll just finish that off by saying that, you know, it's not just that Ben-Gvir and Otzma Yehudit have moderated. Israeli society has moved toward them as well. But there is, you know, if we're talking about Jewish supremacism, there has always been an extent to which Kahana and Kahanism appealed to that kernel, that nationalist, ethnic, religious, racial supremacist kernel that we've talked about. And events over the last 30 years in Israel-Palestine have just served to drive people to embrace that more openly. And Ben-Gvir is now absolutely part of the Israeli mainstream.
Thank you for that, Natasha. Orly, would you comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. I actually wanted to comment on what Natasha mentioned about the political shift that we've been seeing, that one of its manifestations is the legitimization, not only the political, but the public legitimizing of declared Kahanists, such as Itamar Ben-Gvir. I think that it's very interesting to look at what happened with Article 7A in the basic Knesset law. This article basically says that a party or a list, a political list, cannot run for the Knesset if they undermine or do not accept the definition of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Now, initially, that article was put in the Israeli law to prevent the Kahanists from entering the Knesset, because they are defying the democratic nature of Israel. Today, the kahanists, as Natasha said, are about to become perhaps the third strongest political power in the Israeli parliament, while the same article ever since has been using almost exclusively to disqualify Palestinian lists from running to the Knesset time and time again, because they are undermining the Jewish definition of the state of Israel. And I think that this is very indicative, it's very telling about the political developments that Israel went through in the past few decades.
Great, thank you, Orly. That was really helpful. And that was helpful from both of you. Thank you for rooting us in this moment in Israeli politics and in the mainstreaming of these ideas. I want to take a step back for a moment into thinking about the big framing and analytical tools that we can use to understand Israel-Palestine overall. And we talk about apartheid and settler colonialism a lot, as we should. And I want to ask how the concept of Jewish supremacy relates to these concepts of apartheid and settler colonialism, and how thinking about them together can help us to understand how power and oppression work between the river and the sea. And Peter, I want to ask you to first talk about that, because when you started talking about how Jewish supremacy situates Israel-Palestine within this concept of a global struggle and globally. And can you talk to us a little more? You spoke about apartheid, but specifically about thinking about how the settler colonialist aspects of Israel-Palestine also relate globally, or are particular to how you understand Israel-Palestine?
Sure. So I think there's, to me, no question that Israel and political Zionism certainly had clear settler colonial attributes. In this is a movement that kind of aimed to dominate the population that was there, and also had a kind of a modernizing language that was very typical, and also gained, although it had a complicated, also relied on metropolitan powers to do that, through things like the Balfour Declaration. I also think, so you could see that as having similarities with Australia or New Zealand or the United States or Canada. I mean, I also think that there are other, or Algeria. I think actually there are even other examples that may not come to mind as much. For instance, if you think about the way the movement in the Soviet Union of large numbers of people into Central Asia, I think also has colonial features. I also think, and this may be, I also think that the settler colonialism captures something, but also misses something about, or does not capture the way in which, if you only knew that Zionism was a settler colonial movement, you would not understand the centrality of the land of Israel in Jewish tradition and Jewish texts, and the way in which Zionism is conceived by many Jews as a homecoming and also as an asylum. And I think it's important for me to try to hold both of those things. I don't think these two things, I think these things can both have elements of truth in them. And I don't think it requires one, I don't think one has to reject one in order to accept the other. So in terms of, part of the challenge in terms of, I think there is a role for talking about settler colonialism. And I think that one of the values of talking about settler colonialism is that it reminds one that even in a situation in which there is legal equality, right? So Indigenous people in Canada and the United States now have the right to vote, right? They are treated equally under the law. Black South Africans now not only have the right to vote, but actually largely control the government because of their numerical numbers. And yet a settler colonial framework helps us to understand the way in which the roots of settler colonialism mean that even in South Africa, Black South Africans in some ways quite disempowered, let alone in a place like Australia or New Zealand or Canada, United States, where the indigenous population was largely destroyed. So, it makes us remember that just providing equality of the law actually still leaves a lot there's still a huge agenda beyond that if one wants to actually try to deal with historical justice and kind of more substantive equality. I think, though, that if one is talking about the way that different terms can be used to mobilize different people, in some ways, part of again, to go back to what I said before, I think that if you think of the challenge of the United States today, right, many more people would resonate with the struggle against supremacy, white supremacy, Christian supremacy, than the struggle against settler colonialism. Not because we don't have a struggle against settler colonialism, but that struggle is almost buried in the United States, right? We don't even have a conversation in the United States about, for instance, Canada and Australia are a little further along in terms of historical justice for Indigenous people, right? Those are very important conversations, but I think that given that so much of the global discourse is about the supremacy and the rise of kind of bigoted, violent, kind of ethno-nationalist, racist movements, I think that there is a value in joining the conversation about Israel-Palestine to that conversation. I also think that's part of what makes it so jarring to people, because there's so many people in the United States who feel horrified by the notion of white Christian supremacy in the United States and in Europe, and yet have a fairly unquestioned idea for the support of Israel as a Jewish state. And so to suggest that there may be links between these two things is actually really, really upsetting to a lot of people. But I also think that that's part of why there's a value in opening that conversation, because first of all, it challenges the notion that because Jews have a particular history of oppression, therefore Jews and a Jewish state should be an exception to these general rules that I think that liberal-minded people would support. And secondly, I think it's also just worth explicitly saying that there's nothing about being Jewish, I happen to love being Jewish, but there's nothing about being Jewish that means that one cannot be susceptible to the same supremacist politics that any other group can. And that should be obvious, but I actually think that in some ways it needs to be stated, because sometimes it's not obvious to many people that somehow it's like as if we are, because we were history's victims, we are exempted from those tendencies, right? We see and I'll stop, but we see in India, we see in Myanmar, right, with Buddhism, we see that any religious or ethnic or national history can tragically be turned in a supremacist direction. And I think it's important to state that explicitly.
Thank you. That was so powerful. Do you think that this conversation on Jewish supremacy is actually happening among Jewish Americans?
No, I don't, not much yet, but I think it may. I mean, I think right now the battle lines are still around, I tend to be around apartheid. And I would say to some degree around the connection of Zionism, particularly as its relation to anti-Semitism. But I think that I wouldn't be surprised if the conversation about supremacy gains traction. And I think B'Tselem deserves credit for having, it's not that they invented this, again, as you said, Palestinians have been talking about these things for a long time, but I think B'Tselem, as an Israeli organization, gave it a kind of a hechsher, a kind of a stamp of imprimatur that I think is valuable.
Great, thank you. I want to ask the same question of Orly and Natasha about the conversation around Jewish supremacy in Israel. You talked about the mainstreaming of Ben Gvir and of these politics, and that they are now projected to become the third largest. Religious Zionism is projected to become the third largest party in the Knesset, and Ben Gvir is all over the media. Is there a conversation around he's an explicit Jewish supremacist. Is there a conversation around Jewish supremacy, good or bad, or is it just taken for granted?
No, I mean, there is no public discussion about Jewish supremacy in Israel, certainly not as such. there are discussions about the question of racism. But then, as Natasha said, the entire Israeli Jewish community has been so desensitized over the years to manifestations of fascism, of extreme racism, that we do not really distinguish. I mean, as a public, we've sort of lost the ability. Like, Itamar Ben-Gvir's taking down Baruch Goldstein's picture from his living room is sort of a token that is enough for the Israeli public to say, well, he's not the same brat that he used to be, and he's more moderate now, and also the thing is that racism is, I mean, where do you draw the line? If Israel itself, at its very most basic definition, is giving priority to Jewish citizens over other citizens, then where do you draw the line? Where do you? I don't think that as a public we have the ability to say, because otherwise it's just more of this. You know, it's if you have the legitimacy to have more privileges in the most fundamental definition of the state in which you live, then your ability to point out or to distinguish different kind of racism or supremacy is becoming very weak. And you see it also in the public, in the political trends, that we keep shifting to the right more and more and more as a collective. So to answer your question, no, this discussion is not happening in Israel, and very powerful mechanisms are preventing or obstructing the collective ability, the Jewish collective ability to hold that conversation.
Thank you. Natasha, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just, to reply a little bit to your question, Sarah Ann, about, is this conversation happening? And just affirming what Orly is saying, the thing that's really stunning, if you sit and think about it, although maybe is sadly predictable for those of us who are watching this kind of thing, is that traditionally, Ben-Gvir and other kahanists and other far-right Jewish extremists in Israel-Palestine who have kind of been associated with settler violence or violence within the Green Line, have always served as this kind of, well, up until now, as this kind of useful avatar for what Jewish supremacism looks like, or what Jewish extremism looks like. And it's been a real get-out clause for a long time for other right-wing forces in the country to say, well, that's what Jewish supremacism looks like, and we're not that. So therefore, we're the adults in the room, or we're moderates, or we're not extremists, or we shouldn't be censured for our policies and for our views. And it's gotten to the point now where Ben-Gvir can't serve as that avatar anymore, because he's not considered beyond the pale. He's not considered marginal. His views aren't marginal enough to exclude him from the political conversation. And again, I think that, Israeli society, I think, is just, as Orly said, is just kind of been going in this direction anyway, has been assimilating these shifts anyway, but that presents a real challenge to American Jewish and other diaspora Jewish organizations who have long, put their opinions alongside that of those within Israel, who were saying, we can't be called extremists because that's what an extremist looks like, and we're not behaving in that way.
Thanks, Natasha. That is super helpful, and also parallels what Orly was saying earlier about thinking about where merits fits on the scale of Jewish supremacism, what it looks like on the range, and thinking about merits within that context while also differentiating them from the policies of Ben-Gvir and the Kahanists and Smotrich and the other Kahanists. And so in that vein, actually, to many people, and especially to Palestinians, Zionism is inherently a Jewish supremacist ideology. And I want to ask you all to comment on that. If what we're talking about is not just what has developed in Israel over time, but specifically something embedded in Zionist ideologies, I want to ask you if it's possible to have a Zionism that isn't a Jewish supremacist ideology. And Peter, can we start with you?
Sure. So I think what we can say is that there were historically people who called themselves Zionists, people who in some ways as thinkers might have even been influential Zionists, like Achad Ha'am, who I don't think were Jewish supremacists. And the reason they weren't Jewish supremacists is because they weren't trying to create a Jewish state. They weren't trying to create a state that gave Jews rights that Palestinians didn't have. What they wanted was a Jewish presence, a kind of that would do a kind of cultural production in Israel-Palestine, Hebrew language, other kinds of things, and they were really open to different kinds of state forms. That the continuation of Ottoman rule early on, and then people like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus and others who supported a binational state. Now, not to say that these folks didn't have their own blind spots, and they were not politically powerful, but that tradition existed. It's obviously a tradition that has very, very little political influence. So if you want to say, is Zionism as it's practiced by the Israeli state, today, regardless of which political party is in power, is that supremacist? Yes, it is. So then the question goes, what value is there in trying to preserve or imagine the existence of another kind of marginal, cultural Zionism that isn't? Some people might say this is just irrelevant philosophizing. For me, I personally feel like that tradition is valuable partly because I think the notion has become so embedded in certainly American Jewish discourse that essentially goes something along the lines of, if you don't have a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians, you don't have Jews in Israel-Palestine, or you certainly don't have Jews who are flourishing. You don't have Jews who are safe. You don't have Jews that can actually represent something for the rest of the Jewish people around the world. And I think that, so in that regard, I think there's something valuable in saying, actually, no, there were people who imagined a flourishing Jewish society, whatever exactly that means, that lived in equality with Palestinians and others in this territory. Now, and I do think that requires accepting the idea of binationalism, that Israeli Jews represent a people, a nation, alongside Palestinians, and that is controversial in some quarters, in some anti-Zionist quarters, so there will be people who disagree with me, but to my mind, it's kind of self-evidently true that Israeli Jews do see themselves as a people, and I think that there are places in the world where you can see that there is a system of liberal democracy and equality under the law that recognizes that different groups, that different nations want certain forms of cultural autonomy, right? Belgium, for instance, right? That people want to be educated in the language that they speak, that they want to be able to have religious holidays that speak to their religious tradition. So for me, that's the reason that it is useful to think and remember, and I would even say, in my mind, cherish the kind of cultural Zionist tradition, even though it's one that doesn't have political influence today.
Thank you. That's helpful. And so you're differentiating between political and cultural Zionism, and in some ways saying that as long as the focus wasn't on putting an army behind that Zionism, then it was possible to escape the supremacist inclinations, or maybe the chauvinist inclinations that become supremacy. Is that?
Yes.
Thank you. Orly and Natasha, do you want to comment on that? Maybe Natasha first, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to give a historian's answer, which maybe is taking the easy way out. But I do very much identify with what Peter was saying about, needing to address what we're dealing with as a reality first and foremost, rather than kind of philosophizing over what might have been or what could have been. On that note, I'll just add that there were forms of Zionism that weren't even particularly territorial and were much more about, cultural and linguistic and spiritual renewal in place, in different corners of empire in the late 19th and 20th centuries, early 20th centuries. But going back to my historian's answer, I think looking at these different formulations can be valuable because of what I mentioned earlier about how nationalism can deteriorate. And I think it's helpful to look at the material conditions and the environments that produce these ideas, and then what processes and changes in those material conditions led to them becoming the Zionism that we see today, which, as Peter rightly said, is very much applied to supremacist ends in Israel-Palestine.
Thank you. Orly, did you want to add?
Yes, I don't think that, I actually think that this is very interesting and very relevant to think about non-supremacist Zionist options, not just a theoretical exercise of what could have happened. I actually think that in a way, Echad Ha'am spiritual, cultural Zionism is the only branch of Zionism that prevailed, that really achieved its initial goal, because this is the only really added value, Jewish identity that Israel is providing as a center for cultural creation in Hebrew. I think the question of language is very, very central here, and in that sense, Echad Ha'am's school of thought was very much valid and prevailed. Political Zionism really had not a single Jewish thing, really Jewish, to offer us other than brutality and supremacy, etc. Now, I agree with Peter very much that Zionism bites, or the thought that Judaism is something beyond merely a religion, that there are that we are a people in additional ways than just to be defined in terms of religion. But what made the implementation or the materialization of political Zionism in Israel into an inevitable supremacist one, I think it's two factors. The first is demanding exclusivity in terms of national identity or definition in a space that has two national collectives in it. So erasing the other one is one factor. And the other factor is aspiring to expand that it's not territorial, that the definition of the Jewish state is relevant to the entire Jewry of the world, while nation states are, limited. The definition of nationality in a modern national state are limited to a specific territorial unit. And Zionism wanted beyond that. It wanted to include all Jews of the world, at least theoretically. At the same time, it's true that we cannot just erase or disregard the reality, the fact that in the 70-some years of Israel's existence, a new national identity was created of Jewish Israelis. And in that sense, and I think that this is, I'm often asked what a nice Jewish girl is doing in Balad, which is Palestinian National Democratic Party. And I always say I'm there because of my Jewish identity, because this is the only way, speaking of settler colonialism, that we can decolonialize our existence by accepting the legitimacy of the native people, in accepting our national identity as Israeli Jews, not the entire Jewry of the world and not exclusively Jewish, but they can give us that legitimacy, and in return, we should give the same acknowledgement in the other national collective that exists, which is, of course, the Palestinian citizens.
Thank you, Orly. Peter, do you have a comment on what Orly and Natasha said? Do you want to say any more about Zionism and supremacy?
No, I agree very much with what they're saying, and I think that there is a. I think that what often happens is that there's a conversation about the word self-determination often gets used in the American context. The idea is, well, don't Jews deserve self-determination? Don't Jews or don't Israeli Jews deserve self-determination? And people will say, well, Palestinians deserve self-determination, then surely Jews deserve self-determination as well. And I think that one thing that I think thinking about the cultural Zionist tradition allows us to do is to remember that self-determination doesn't mean sovereignty. It doesn't mean a supremacist state. Self-determination can mean that your community, that a state that treats you as equal to your neighbors can delegate certain authority that allows a community to have its own institutions. And that is a form of self-determination, and that within a binational equal state, that therefore Israeli Jews would have self-determination, just like Palestinians would have self-determination, and they would also be treated equally in a state that was neither a Jewish supremacist state nor a Palestinian supremacist state.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that, and appreciate that we keep drilling down into nuance that I think is actually very helpful and important in terms of defining and redefining what specifically we're talking about. And so actually to close, I want to bring up a place that I think I heard Orly and Peter disagree. And so I want to ask you all to comment on it, which is, so Peter talked about one of the limits of just using settler colonialism as a framework to understand Israel-Palestine is that one of the things that you then miss is the long relationship between Jews, Jewish people, Jewish culture, history, liturgy to the land of Israel, and specifically the ways in which Jewish presence in Israel now is experienced as a kind of homecoming. So that is missed when settler colonialism is the only frame. And Orly, you just talked about this one piece of what Zionism, political Zionism did, which was be extraterritorial, which was actually say that Jews around the world are implicated in the state of Israel. And here we are on a call with 4 Jews with multiple passports among us. But whether or not we are Israeli citizens, we are, each of us at one point in our lives was a potential Israeli citizen. And we could all maybe accepting for certain political reasons now, though I don't even think so yet, become Israeli citizens tomorrow were we to want to. And so my question is, and this is actually a question for all of you, is it possible for a non-Palestinian, and especially for a Jewish person, so a non-Palestinian Jew, but a Jewish person, not indigenous to that land, to cultivate or to have attachment now to Israel or to Israel-Palestine that isn't expressed or articulated through a kind of Jewish supremacy? And if that is possible, how do you do it?
I mean, I think it is empirically. I mean, to give one example, I mean, let's say Satmar Hasidim, right? I mean, Satmar Hasidim are historically anti-Zionist, remain largely anti-Zionist, and yet still have a very, very strong attachment to, the land of Israel for religious reasons, and also because they are a transnational community that have a lot of people in Israel, Palestine, as long as other people. And I think it is. I think I think for many diaspora Jews around the world, they would feel amputated if they could not have, if they could not feel like they had a relationship with the people and even in some sense, whatever it means, the land, because they've grown up, as you said, with traditions, with liturgies that have emphasized that, and they may have family there, or just an abstract recognition that, 40% of the Jews around the world or so live in that territory. And I think that's understandable and reasonable and natural and should be accepted. Then the difficult question is, how does it get expressed in a way that is not supremacist and that doesn't end up trampling on the rights of Palestinians? And in practice, that is a challenge when, the very act of going to Israel and, being waved through Ben Gurion Airport, et cetera, having the chances, or all these things, and that your Palestinian friends and neighbors who may have been born there, whose parents are denied all those things. So I think at the very least, one has to struggle with that. In terms of where ultimately I would like to imagine one day we could potentially be, would be in an equal country that provided equality under the law and was also able to say, and therefore had an immigration policy that did not privilege Jews over Palestinians, certainly, but could also say, given that we are a state made up of Jews and Palestinians, that we have a special concern for any Jews or Palestinians around the world who are in distress, and that while we have a robust asylum policy for anyone in distress around the world, we might say that given that we would have a priority for Palestinians and Jews wherever they were who were in danger, and that this state would have a particular concern for that. So that might be, for me, one way that a future equal state could reflect that connection.
Thanks, Peter. Orly?
Yeah, I actually agree with Peter, but I just want to, it's true, Peter, that Satmar Haredim can relate to the land of Israel not through the lenses of Zionism. But at the same time, the Jewish privileges are sort of imprinted on us just by being Jewish, and the Satmar Haredim are no exception, because just by being Jewish, they do have the privilege to become a citizen in Israel. They choose not to, but the privilege is imprinted in them, as opposed to Palestinian refugees who have roots here for hundreds of years and still do not have the same privileges. And I am a living example for that. Yeah, when I immigrated to Israel from Iran at the age of 9, I already had more privileges in it than any Palestinian, not just refugees, but also inside Israel. And there is, I think, and I think that all of us, sort of growing up in non-Israeli Jewish communities, we know that there is such a thing, such an affiliation, attraction, connection, emotional, historic, religious connection to of Jewish communities to the land of Israel. Nobody can deny that. But I think that what Zionism did very manipulatively is to turn the term love of Zion, Ahavat Zion, that's an entirely different thing than Zionism, certainly in its political understanding or interpretation today. So we should hold on to the idea of Ahavat Zion, of the love of Zion. It's there and nobody can take it away. But this is not a theoretical or religious discussion. This is the way that these connections are being translated into political, brutal power at the expense of native inhabitants of this land and their political right. And this is the question that we should be dealing with. Nobody is taking away our emotional, historic, religious connections to the land of Israel. The only to Eretz Israel, yes, not the state of Israel. The only thing is how do we not translate it into Jewish supremacist political entity? And we haven't been able to do that, or we're not willing to do that, unfortunately, so far.
Thank you, Orly. Thank you. What a powerful statement. Peter, Natasha, Orly, I'm so grateful to all of you for this conversation. And I want to ask you to offer any last words that you want to ask. I think that Orly's last question is really the question for us that you've left with us, which is no one has been able to create the non-Jewish supremacist root or structures yet so far. Are there any last comments that you want to make before we close?
Yeah, I'll jump in with something quickly that I think ties into what Orly was just saying then, which I agree was really powerful, and also just referring back to our, I think, justifiably frequent mentions of kahanism and Ben Gvir. I think we're right to identify this as, a particularly heightened form of Jewish supremacism. I think we're right to identify this as, kahanism as a discrete phenomenon. But I think it's important not to get too distracted by its discreteness, because I've said this before in some of my articles for 972, but there does not need to be a Kahanist party in the Knesset for some of the policies that Kahana and his, ideological progeny have championed for decades to just be the order of the day. Otzma Yehudit does not need to be in the Knesset to perpetrate ethnic cleansing, to demolish people's homes, to conduct extrajudicial assassinations in the street, to enable settlers to violently attack Palestinians and their property, either with impunity or active collaboration with soldiers. So I think when we talk about Jewish supremacism, I think we need to identify its sharp points, but I think we also need to go back to what we were saying at the beginning about identifying its roots and identifying the aspects of it that are really woven into the state's institutions and that are present in the Israeli regime, not as some kind of aberration or politics run amok, but absolutely by design.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Peter.
Just end by one. My fear is that supremacist politics, ethnic, racial, religious, will continue to grow around the world, and that will make Jewish supremacist politics more legitimate. Because people already say this, well, everyone else has a state, right? What they really mean by that is not entirely clear often, right? But the more it actually becomes the case that actually this is mainstream normalized politics around the world, the more I think the easier it will be to me. And also we have this paradox. I mean, I'm very struck by some people I know. They said after Trump got elected, their daughter, who was in a Jewish high school, woke up and said, I need to make Aliyah. I'm only going to be safe in Israel, right? So you think about that. They were reacting to the rise of Christian white supremacists in the United States, essentially by saying, oh, they need this language. Well, if there's going to be supremacism everywhere, the only way I can be safe is to go to the place where I have supremacists of my group, right? That's going to be a terrible, terrible world, right? And so I think it just makes all important for us to see the interconnection of these struggles and the way in which I think that that unless we begin to be able to have a more effective struggle against Jewish supremacism in Israel, we are going to end up creating a world that legitimizes forms of supremacism that are going to actually be dangerous for diaspora Jews, and actually create a world in which the idea of equality as a vision becomes more and more distant. And that's what I fear.
Thank you, Peter. Orly.
Yes, so just for conclusion, I want to go very briefly to your introduction, Sarah Ann. I was like Natasha, quite surprised that the discourse of Jewish supremacy is easier to digest for Jewish communities outside Israel or in America, rather than concepts such as apartheid and occupation and so on. And I would, if there is a sense of solidarity, of connection, of Jewish net of some sort, then I would very much urge the Jewish communities to not to take the notion of supremacy lightly in any way, because laws can be revoked, legal constructions can be changed, but the notion of supremacy that intrigues or that penetrates so deeply into the minds and concepts and conceptions of Israeli Jews would be very, very difficult to deal with, to heal. I think this is really sort of a disease that would need to be healed at some point. And it will be very difficult to heal those sentiments even after God willing, apartheid would fall, and as soon as possible, we hope.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all three of you. This has been such a rich discussion, and I hope the start of a discussion. One of the things that you all said essentially is that the specific discussion around Jewish supremacy, it's not happening in the diaspora, it's not happening among Jewish Americans, it's not happening in Israel, as Jewish supremacy is on the rise more and more. And I think that there's so much more to say and to discuss. And I am so grateful to all three of you for sharing your time and your analysis and your insights today. And I want to thank the listeners who are listening to this podcast for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, www.fmep.org. for resources related to this podcast, for lots of other great content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you can stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, on SoundCloud, on Spotify, and you can also watch video versions of our podcast, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I am Sarah Ann Minkin, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts. Thanks so much and take care.